Alexander Morozevich was known for his highly original and aggressive playing style, but what was also interesting is that he used the French defense as his main defense against 1e4, which is certainly very rare on the elite level. In 2008, when this game was played, he was even ranked number 2 in the world, only behind Vishy Anand, so definitely at the very top. And today you'll see Morozevich play the French in a very bold and uncompromising way. He played a really great game, so let's jump right in. He played the Bosnian GM Borki Predojevic. Predojevic had white and opened with e4, and with e6, Morozevich indicates he wants to play the French, and after d4, d5, and knight to c3, he chooses the classical variation with knight to f6. The e-pawn's hanging, so white usually plays bishop g5 or e5. In this case, e5 was white's choice. Now black wants to follow up with c5 to undermine white's center pawns, therefore f4 to reinforce the center. Then c5 attacking d4, so knight to f3. Knight c6 then attack d4 a second time, and bishop to e3 overprotects the pawn, and we've reached a very standard French position. Black now has a number of ways to play. By far the most common are a6, bishop e7, and c takes d4. Morozevich chose a6, which often prepares expansion on the queen side with b5. An often played continuation is now queen to d2, after which black does go b5, and queen to b6 is usually next to once again pressure d4. In the game, Predojevic went another way with knight to e2. Now c2, c3 is on white's agenda, bolstering d4 yet again. But watch how Morozevich still manages to put more pressure on white's position. First, queen to b6. White has d4 covered sufficiently, but the b-pawn isn't defended. So queen to c1, but now check out this outrageous move, g5, and it's moves like this that made Morozevich so popular. He wasn't afraid to play risky chess, even with the black pieces, but of course this is risky for both players. If black can take on f4 or advance with g4, then white's center pawns may become weak. White's move was very logical, he covered the d-pawn with c3. Now a clearly worse way to play for white would be knight takes g5. You can see straight away that d4 is weak now, and after c takes d4 and bishop to c5, black has already equalized. The real acid test for black's play is simply pawn takes g5. Yes, black does get to destroy white's pawn center, but that's not all that matters. Here white could first trade on e5, then white takes a little time out with c3, otherwise bishop to c5 is a good move for black. And if black then goes for that bishop on e3 with knight to g4, then white can just allow that, and after this trade, yes, white lost the bishop pair, but white is ready to castle, and he can even consider castling on either side. Black is at least 2 moves away from castling, and that light squared bishop isn't very impressive just yet, being stuck behind the pawns. It's quite double-edged, but it's probably more difficult to play for black. Going back to the game, as mentioned, Predojevic bolstered his center pawn with c3. So it looks safe enough for white, but watch how Morozevich mixed things up. First, a trade on d4, and then bishop to b4, and that's a very irritating check, because white has to move the king. If white tries to block the check with either the knight or the bishop, it actually doesn't matter. Then black just kicks the knight on f3 with g4, and when the knight moves, the d-pawn isn't defended enough anymore, and black just takes it. Therefore, king to f2, but now an instructive move, f6 by Morozevich. Now that is a standard move in the French anyway, because white has a space advantage, and so black wants to challenge white's strong pawns. But you can see that the king on f2 is now more vulnerable. If the f-file opens up and black can put a rook on f8, that king could get in trouble. Now g3 by white. If black would take on f4, then at least white could recapture with the pawn to keep the f-file closed. And here Morozevich improved on an earlier game. In 2007 he played rook to f8 against Topalov, but after king to g2, Topalov's king was actually safe and Morozevich lost that game. In today's game he played g4, and after knight to h4, the e-pawn has lost a defender, and now watch Morozevich really up the pressure. First a trade on e5, and then a thematic sacrifice in the French. Knight takes e5, which for the moment only wins a pawn for the piece. However, after d takes e5, d4 does underline white's awkward piece placement. And when the bishop slides to f4, rook to f8 also highlights that white's king doesn't really have a great square, and knight takes e5 is also threatened because of the pin. So king to g2. Black still only has a pawn for the piece, but black is better developed and he'll bring more pieces in the game very quickly. Bishop to d7 was next, which also prepares the second rook to come over to c8. But that queen all the way on b6 could also be a threat. Just a quick example, let's say white goes queen to d1, allowing rook to c1 and keeping an eye on black's pawns, then white is already losing after d3. And if white saves the knight, then knight takes e5 is a killer move. This isn't even black's only strong move, he could also take on c3 and go queen b2 check. And of course, if bishop takes knight, then queen f2 is a very sudden checkmate. So that queen lurking on the edge of the board is very much a threat as well. Anyway, white played a much better move, he went h3. White's looking for a safe haven for the king. Now the plan is to take on g4 and put the king on h3. And even after Morozevich attacked the knight with d3, white wisely decided to give the piece back and took on g4 anyway. Again, if knight to c3, then black has this move again, knight takes e5, and now the light square bishop will claim the long diagonal as well. That would be dreadful for white. So white sacks the knight and continues as planned with pawn takes g4, although after pawn takes and bishop takes e2, Morozevich is still clearly better after knight to d4, attacking the bishop, but also planning bishop c6 check, or maybe hit the queen with rook to c8. And even though black didn't castle either, you can see the black king is completely safe for the moment. White has to be very careful to not fall apart immediately. Queen e3 was played, defending the bishop, which is very reasonable, but after bishop to c5, under pressure, Predojevic does make a mistake. He knew he was worse, and it's a very difficult position to play, so I completely understand why he went for b4. I'll come back to this position in a moment. His point was that after queen takes b4, he gets counterplay after this move. When the queen moves, the rook hits that loose pawn, and he may get decent play against black's king. And especially after king to h3, his king actually doesn't look so bad. Let me briefly go back to this position. Here Predojevic played b4, but white would have been fine after king to h3, so allowing this fork, but white will get the material back. After queen to d2 and this trade, black's best is to castle, but after bishop to g5, the rook is hit, and it turns out black cannot avoid losing material. Of course, if black doesn't move the rook, then white wins the exchange back right away. If black does try to keep the exchange and moves the rook, then white will go rook to c1, threatening with b4. Bishop c6 is the only move, but watch this. White now has this great move, bishop to f3. That bishop is hanging now. However, after bishop takes bishop, there is bishop to e3. That dark square bishop is pinned in a couple of ways. And after the retreat, here's the point. Bishop takes c5, forks queen and rook. And as I said, white wins the exchange back. Of course, not easy at all to see that over the board, but white wouldn't have lost material after all if he allowed the fork. Going back to the game, we got b4, queen takes b4, and rook from h to b1. And now let's see how Morozevich managed to stir up more trouble. But first things first, he moved the queen. And after king to h3, he simply picked up material after knight takes bishop, queen takes, and bishop to d4, because that rook is trapped. However, it's still a sharp game. White tried bishop to h6, counterattacking black's rook, but with rook to f2, Morozevich counterattacked the queen, so that after queen to e4, white still lost the exchange. The game is almost over, but it's never too late to castle. Now the king will never get in danger, but this also guards the b-pawn. Rook c1 check doesn't really do anything. Black blocks with the bishop, and white cannot even try to sack on c6 and take the pawn, because after king to b8, white already runs out of checks and black's up a lot of material for nothing. So instead, bishop g5 by white, attacking the rook, but bishop to c6 counterattack the queen. Rook c1 pins, but Morozevich can keep it very simple. He simply offered a queen trade, which white of course didn't agree to, but then queen takes a2, threatening with rook h2 mate. Rook takes c6 check was still tried, followed by knight to f3, preventing checkmate, but by this point this is just silly. Black took that, and after bishop takes rook and king takes, realizing he's a rook down for no compensation, Predojevic resigned. Very nice game by Morozevich. There's always some originality and creativity in his games, which makes them great to watch, but unfortunately also very hard to emulate for most people. Anyway, let's check out some key moments. So after they reached a pretty standard French position, Morozevich started to mix things up with this very daring g5 move, which soon weakened white's control over e5, which allowed this classic knight sacrifice on e5, which started opening up paths to the white king. But it was at this point that white went wrong. It's completely understandable that he hadn't foreseen everything after this knight c2 move. It made sense to go for counterplay with b4 instead, but that ended up losing material like this. And it didn't take long before Morozevich had this checkmate threat, which meant more material loss for white, and then it only made sense to resign. So again, a great game by Morozevich. Let me know in the comments who your favorite creative chess player is. If you enjoyed, please simply like the video, it's that simple, and do consider subscribing to the channel. There's another great game next weekend, so I'll be seeing you guys again soon, and take care.